For those of you who don't know, two currencies sort of circulate in China. There's a mainland currency that is used for transactions onshore and sits behind a perimeter of capital controls that can be mainly used by Chinese residents, okay? And that goes by the currency code CNY. And there's an offshore parallel currency that is freely convertible, can be held by anyone, and goes by the currency code CNH, where H stands for Hong Kong. Okay, that's where the transactions in this currency take place. These two currencies officially convert one for one, but because there are barriers to convertibility, there can be two different market prices for the currency, two different exchange rates, okay, or one exchange rate. So why do this? Fundamentally, it's part of an internationalization strategy, right? The Chinese government wants to have foreigners use the yuan for transactions, to make payments, pay for trade. For that to happen, they need to have liquid balances denominated in yuan, and that's where CNH comes in, okay? More broadly, it fits into a policy of an open current account and a closed capital account, okay? So open current account means that if you have a transaction that would fall under the current account, okay, conversion between CNH and CNY is free, right? So if you have a trade invoice that would back the transaction, you can make the conversion, okay? If the transaction would fall under the capital account, then you have restrictions, quotas, all these different things that prevent the free flow of money from CNY to CNH and from CNY broadly to the rest of the world, okay? So parallel currencies have been attempted in the past, but never on the scale, right? So China is the world's biggest exporter. Half its trade is settled in yuan via the CNH, basically, right? So it's a big deal in that sense. But also, you can learn a lot about how monetary economics sort of affects exchange rates by studying this very unique system. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do today. What's interesting about parallel currency, though, is there's separate tensions, right? And there's two in particular that are sort of changing how policy works in the Chinese context. The first is Gresham's law. So you have these two currencies that are officially convertible one for one, but they have they have a market price, they have different utilities. If that market price deviates too much from one, okay, there'll be a huge pressure in terms of arbitrage to try and break those capital controls, or one currency won't be used in equilibrium. Okay, so on the left, what I'm showing you here is deviation from parity. And actually, the PBOC does a pretty good job in terms of maintaining CNY equal to CNH in terms of exchange rate. So deviations from parity sort of vary between 1 or 200 basis points, up or down. In extreme cases, most of the time, it's in like a 20, 30 basis point range. That's way larger than the round trip transaction cost of going via dollar, buying CNH, selling CNY, okay? So this is definitely evidence that capital controls bind, but it's not a huge deviation from parity, okay? But, so they're trying to keep, CNH in line with CNY. One easy way of doing that is just allowing conversion, right? You just allow the capital to go back and forth, allow arbitrage. The second tension is, a CNH is a claim on China, okay? If I allow foreigners to accumulate that claim, I lose control of my capital account. Okay, they can just buy as much as they want. That's a claim on me. Suddenly my closed capital account breaks down. So they have to control the supply of CNH. Okay, and what I'm showing you here is sort of CNH deposits in Hong Kong on the right-hand side, and actually there are quite large swings in the value of CNH outstanding. Okay, and that's them trying to control the supply. Okay, so they have to hit both the price and the supply, or the quantity, at the same time, and that poses policy challenges. So how do they do that, right? How do they maintain these two things? So what do we do in this paper? The first thing I want to do, and this is basically to help you understand the empirics that we run, is just describe how the system works from a monetary policy perspective. So who are the institutions involved, how they're actually implementing policy, okay? And it's an unusual mix of different institutions. However, in the end, it boils down to a quantity-based system where the quantity of money is varied to influence the exchange rate and wider policy goals, okay? there is no interest rate policy in CNH. It's all quantity-based. Okay? Then I'm going to have a little model of offshore banking, okay? And basically explain how this offshore money can be used as a current account management tool. Okay, how you can actually use it to achieve goals regarding China's offshore position, okay, or external position. And what we show is that the combination of controls, quantity controls on cross-border capital flows, and offshore money essentially implements a capital inflow tax. Okay? And what we can do, which is quite fun, is link that tax to monetary variables. Okay? And what we show is that how much the exchange rate appreciates or depreciates in response to an increase in money supply actually pins down the slope of that tax, which I'll show you in a few slides. And so we can use that to estimate how elastic money demand is in CNH, and also figure out the policy rule for how the central bank responds to changes in the exchange rate. Okay? What we find actually is that money alone is insufficient to maintain the peg. Okay, they need other tools, and that makes sense. They have two different goals: capital account stabilization, maintain the peg. They need two tools. It's Tinbergen principle. Okay, so we talk about, in the last part of the paper, which we won't have time to go into today, other policies they're using to actually sustain this peg beyond simple quantity-based models. And we call these liquidity policies, things like reserve requirements, constraints on liquidity flows, discount window lending. They're all being varied in order to achieve the peg. Okay. Right. So let me explain the monetary regime first. So the actual issuer of CNH reserves, CNH money, is not the People's Bank of China. Okay? It's actually an offshore clearing bank that exists in Hong Kong. They have an account at the PBOC in CNY, okay? And in exchange, they issue CNH deposits to clearing banks in Hong Kong. Okay, so that's how the monetary system works. The People's Bank of China controls the money supply at sort of relatively low frequency by issuing bills denominated in CNH. When those bills are redeemed, they pay the clearing bank in CNY, and then the clearing bank will pay banks in Hong Kong in CNH. So that's the monetary expansion when the bills get paid back. Okay? The third or fourth agent in the system is the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Okay? They essentially act as a lender of last resort. They have a deposit at the clearing bank, which they'll lend out at a high frequency to banks in Hong Kong in order to moderate the money supply at daily or intraday frequencies. And they have the PLP facility, like their main one that they use, like a sort of repo facility, and they also have sort of discount facility as well. Okay, so that's sort of the system. That's how it works, and it really maps into your standard central bank. It's just that you have different institutions doing the same things, right? So the clearing bank is a settlement institution. The PBOC is the ultimate backer of the currency, and the HKMA is sort of lender of last resort. Put them all together, you get a central bank, basically. It's just different labels. Okay? So, given we have this setup, we want to think, okay, how can we have a scarce money system with this offshore market and maintain a peg and implement capital controls? Okay? So let me just sketch a very simple model for you. I won't go into details of a short presentation, and then discuss what we get out of it, and then take it to the data a little bit. Okay, so the model, it's a 2-period, perfect foresight, endowment economy, open, okay, of China. And 3 different agents will play a key role in the model. There are others too, but I'll focus on 3. The first is Chinese households. So we impose some capital controls on those households. They can invest onshore, and they can also hold the offshore currency. Right? And we have in mind there that they trade abroad, they receive revenues in CNH, and they can accumulate those balances. Okay? And those offshore deposits they have, they're useful. They enter utility, they have some value to them, okay? Because they can pay for things with them, they can send their kids abroad and go to Cambridge or whatever with those deposits. And there's some demand elasticity attached to those deposits, so I'm going to call it epsilon D. Okay? And then E, the offshore exchange rate, is the relative price of those deposits compared to domestic money. The second agent are Chinese banks. Okay? They're competitive, they lend onshore, and they raise money onshore and offshore, okay, and hold offshore reserves issued by the clearing bank. And the only real key ingredient here that makes banks interesting is they have some liquidity cost, phi, of issuing an offshore deposit, okay? And that phi is going to depend on their reserve to deposit ratio, which I'm going to call X, and lambda, which is some other policies the PBOC can play with to influence money demand by Chinese banks. Okay? Because they get a benefit from holding reserves, there's also an intricacy of reserve demand, which is epsilon M, and there's also a marginal cost of issuing a deposit, which I'm calling psi of X. Okay? Last agent, foreigners, super simple. They can't hold assets in China, but they can hold the offshore currency, and they do so subject to UIP holding with foreign returns, which are exogenous. So what do we get out of this? First point, there's an equivalence between this combination of capital controls and the presence of offshore money and a capital inflow tax. And individual tax is quite straightforward, okay? So foreigners can only actually earn the offshore rate. They can't invest onshore. And that offshore rate is RD. Okay, when banks supply the offshore money, they have to factor in the fact they're paying this liquidity cost. Okay, so they set the offshore rate RD. Where's my little clicker? Oh, this one. There we go. RD plus this liquidity cost equal to the onshore rate. Okay, and when you work through the maths, you get that there's an effective tax for foreigners on investing in China, which is proportional to this liquidity cost. Okay? Now, that tax depends on how willing banks are to supply deposits. Okay? It turns out that the slope of that tax function is just equal to the intricacy of reserve demand. Okay? So if we know what that object is, we can actually just figure out how steep that tax function is and what a monetary expansion does to effective tax. And we actually can estimate it because you work through the maths. How the exchange rate reacts to monetary expansion just depends on the relative slope of demand and supply in the deposit market and the reserve market. So you get this nice expression here saying that the exchange rate reaction to a monetary expansion is just the intricacy of reserve demand plus the reserve to deposit ratio times intricacy of deposit demand, inverted, okay? We know what X is. This we can calibrate from other data in Hong Kong. It's for proxy 10. I'm going to estimate this D log E to log M, and I can figure out how much that tax will change as money supply is changing. Okay, so how do we do that? So what I'm plotting here for you is the stock of CNH bills issued by the PBOC. So go back to my second slide. This in the top left of the diagram is what the PBOC was using to control the money supply. Okay. What you're seeing here is that they started issuing bills in around 2018, okay, and they reached sort of stable stock of around 80 billion RMB, okay, but they kept on playing with the schedule, okay. So as the schedule varied, the tenors that were outstanding moved around, okay? Even though the level of the stock in the long run remained constant, there were periods where bills rolled off and weren't immediately replaced, okay? Even though they went back to normal eventually, okay? And you can sort of see that on the plot, these little jagged lines going downwards, okay? So these are our monetary shocks. These are monetary expansions, okay? So what happens to the exchange rate in that situation, okay? That's what I'm putting up on the board here on the right. You're seeing that as M goes up, the CNH depreciates relative to CNY, okay, versus a perceived by bootstrap. And so if you take that expansion, so roughly a 5.5% expansion depreciates the exchange rate by 0.11%, you can estimate intricacy of reserve demand and get a value of 48, which is very close to the US, What does that mean? It means that if I cut back the money supply by 1%, I'm going to raise that tax by 2 basis points. So that's what comes out of this. Okay? The other question we want to ask, let's over this, is it the case that they accommodate movements in the exchange rate by printing more money? So if we see a deviation from parity, they print more money. So I want to estimate a sort of policy rule for the exchange rate. Okay? So we have a change in M in response to, sorry, for money supply, a change in M in response to a deviation from parity, okay, E. I have 2 questions. Is this eta non-zero? So is there a reaction? And is it big enough to actually bring our peg back to 0, right? Or exchange it back to 1, okay? The issue is that E is contaminated by shocks to M, right? We have this issue regarding reverse causality, right? So we have an instrument which I won't explain too much because I'm running out of time. But basically, we use how the CNY USD exchange rate is managed to get movements in E which aren't affected by M, basically. That's how we do it. Okay. So if you look at this, this is our local projection responses. What we're seeing is that a 1% movement in the exchange rate is accommodated by 5 billion yuan expansion in my demand. Okay. This is a least squares estimator. We had Paul a few presentations ago saying it should be biased towards 0. It is. We're getting that result from this. Okay. And so we're seeing this 5 billion yuan expansion in response to a depreciation of the exchange rate. Okay. Is that enough to restore parity? And actually, you just run through the numbers. The answer is no. Okay. Actually, it explains a sixth of the response. And actually, this is intuitive because remember, we have these 2 different goals. We want to maintain our external position and peg the exchange rate. So we have 2 different goals, 1 tool. Actually, we should be using 2 tools to hit 2 targets. Okay. What is the other tool? These are these liquidity policies. Okay. So let me just very briefly describe what we mean by these, and I'll conclude. So we have these 2 goals: control the external position, hit the peg. Okay. So I need to do things that change this phi function independent of x to achieve that goal. Okay. And so that could be reserve requirements, lender of last resort, controls and flows of liquidity. And what we do in the paper is actually go through other examples of things they use and show they use the exchange rate. And we might have found this function phi. Okay. So I guess I'm out of time now, right? So let me just conclude. So what are the key lessons from this? Right, so an offshore currency with capital controls is a way to basically effectively generate a capital flow tax. That's the cool thing about it, okay? What we found is that implementing the system does not require unusually scarce money, but it does require this sort of suite of different policy tools for it to work, okay? And along the way, you sort of revisited a bunch of different principles in monetary economics. I've shown you that if you raise the money supply, you would appreciate your exchange rate, kind of standard, but hard to show most of the time. If you want to peg, you have to print more money to achieve that, or take away money. Okay, you must complement your money supply with other policies. Okay, and for parallel currencies to survive, you do want to achieve a peg for Gresham's law reasons. Okay, so let me end there. Look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Lucia, for inviting me to discuss this paper. I received the paper about 2.5 weeks ago, so I'm still at the pretty early stage of understanding the basic mechanism of this model in the paper. So I will stay at a high level and to talk about some of my perhaps related clarification questions to this paper. Just to motivate, this is a picture from, I think, a 10-year-old paper by Helen Ray. The picture is 10-year-old, maybe it changes now, but this is a visualization of global financial network, and the size of the nodes is representing the importance of the country to the network. And probably it's hard to find where China is, right? Say HN is this bright small dot, like just below US. And Hong Kong is on the left up. And if you look at the trade network, China is quite large. It's probably the largest or second largest largest at the time when the plot was generated. And if you compare those two plots, usually the large nodes on the second plot in the trade network, they appear to be large in the first chart, except for China. China has not much footprint in the financial network, but is very present in the trade network. And also, if you look at a sort of a rank of importance of currency in the global currency market, Yuan is ranked in the top 5, but mainly in exchange turnover, payment, and foreign reserves, but not much in the international debt and loan market. So why this is the case? Essentially, this is a reflection of the reality in China that we have one currency and two markets. So China has another one country, two system thing. But in currency, we have one currency and two markets there. So just give you an example. So if my mom want to wire me some money because my second son is born and she wants to give us some gift money in Swiss francs, she has to convert it in her commercial bank onshore. But the onshore commercial bank has to first convert it to the offshore Chinese yuan and then convert it to Swiss francs and hold for her in custody. And then she has to apply for the purpose of the transaction of these Swiss francs and then get approved, and then she can send that amount of money to Switzerland. So this is a live example of capital control. So we have these two different markets of the same currency. So you can imagine the price of the same currency are not the same in those two markets, right? So on one hand, it's pairing with an open current account that allows free trades with the rest of the world. That's why China becomes the largest exporter and the second largest economy. And on the other hand, there is an onshore market that is paired with a closed capital account of China. So there's a strict controls of any payments associated with financial in and outflows. So there's a tension there. One side is marketization or internationalization of yuan. The other side is capital control. And the bridge between those two is this sort of now an official market in Hong Kong, an onshore and offshore exchange market. Virtually, the peg is set at 1, but it allows the fluctuation around 1 in a credible way. So this is what this paper is about. The peg management of the Chinese policymaker or government. It demystified the institutional features of achieving a credible peg between the onshore and the offshore currency, and it developed a model to illustrate the mechanism behind the peg and test using these very special settings to some classic principles in international economics, linking money and exchange rate. The finding is very interesting. Exogenous, anticipated, and transitory increase in the supply of money depreciates the exchange rates. That's what Saleem has been talked about. And also there's a study about the usage of the liquidity policy, and it turns out it serves as a complement of capital control. And this is also very interesting. And the paper is very interesting on its own right, because given the size of Chinese economy in the global system, and many things I am not aware of. I myself is a Chinese offshore, so there are many details and things I just learned by reading this interesting paper. So I have 3 comments or thoughts. I hope I have enough time to talk all of them, and 2 are based on a very quick observation of this chart. This is time series plot of the onshore and offshore exchange rate history, and you can see that it appears to be stationary, fluctuating around 1. So whenever we know the difference between 2 random variables is stationary, you can say that those 2 random variables are co-integrated. Right? It means there's at least 1 grander causality relationship here, or maybe 2. So you could raise the question naturally, what is the price discovery mechanism of yuan in the onshore and offshore market? And in any model, try to explain those three variables, given you only have 2 degrees of freedom, if there's no upcharge in the triangular relationship, then you're kind of constrained in the sense that, for instance, in this model, it seems the onshore Chinese exchange rate is a sideshow. The offshore and the onshore offshore exchange rate are determined in equilibrium, so automatically you have the onshore exchange rate, which is the extreme form of marketization of yuan. It's the full internalization of yuan, if that's the case. But in reality, it might be not the case yet. I've tried to thought about other alternatives to let maybe the exchange rate between onshore and offshore being a sideshow, or the offshore being a sideshow that is also not very plausible. So I think maybe an alternative for the authors is probably just allow the possibility that no triangular arbitrage to fail in these settings. Then you could have a model that allows you to endogenize these 3 exchange rates, and then you could have a say about the relative pricing power onshore and offshore. My second comment is also related to this chart. Another observation is that this time series of onshore-offshore exchange rate is not a constant over time. So a credible peg in a stochastic or dynamic setting could be sort of as the expected onshore-offshore exchange rate equalized to 1. But this doesn't guarantee your expectation of the onshore and offshore value of the same currency is the same, because there is a covariance term that links those things. So let me walk through the algebra a bit. So left-hand side is an offshore exchange rate. Right-hand side is the onshore exchange rate with dollar, and also onshore-offshore exchange rates. If you take expectations, or you calculate the sample mean of the observation, you would have an additional covariance between the onshore value and the onshore-offshore exchange rate. A credible peg would assume the expectation of the exchange rate between onshore-offshore equalized to 1, but you would also require the covariance between the onshore currency value and the onshore-offshore exchange rate uncorrelated. And this covariance being 0 is not guaranteed, and it's probably the paper could clarify whether this is actually an assumption or something that the authors have in mind, because the paper is a 2-period model, it's not really a full dynamic setting. But this assumption is plausible. If you take log normal assumption, and then you could show that the covariance 0 between onshore currency and onshore-offshore currency exchange rate implies that the volatility of the offshore currency price is larger than the onshore currency price, which is what the author claimed that the policies that are related to the onshore-offshore exchange rate serves as a pressure valve in some sense. And that is essentially a bit of a technical assumption any model, I guess, would have to assume to have this desirable feature. And I also have a different version of this credible peg when you think about an expected log of the exchange rate instead of expected level. And the same logic works through, and this covariance condition things matter, and it might be very helpful to justify this a bit. I think there is some discussion in the paper saying the PBOC policy of the flow fixing is irrelevant to the onshore-offshore exchange, and that might help to justify that covariance term is 0, I guess. That's the way I understand why this should be 0, but maybe in the model you should probably more explicitly say that. And very quickly, I have 20 seconds. I was thinking maybe there is also a way to link it to external imbalance. If you think about a cyclical external imbalance of a country, the current imbalance has to be offset by the future return of asset and liability of or net asset of foreign investment and trade surplus. In the United States situation, the left-hand side is very negative, so it has to be large future surplus or large return in the future, or depreciation of dollar. And that comes from R. In the Chinese innovation, the trade part has two terms. And since the trade is measured, the current account is offshore, it's measured in the offshore currency. You then have a exchange rate between the on and offshore term. And unconditionally, if the peg is credible, this term would become zero. But conditionally, the covariance would matter. So it might be a new channel to think when you want to link these two external imbalance for China, that this currency peg onshore, offshore might just be an interesting new channel to think about this dynamic. And that's my last thought. Thank you.
So thanks, Ken, for the discussion. It's very welcome. It turns out I only write two-period models and no expectations. It seems to be the thread from both discussions. But no, it's well taken, and yeah, we can think about that covariance term. Just to make one point, in terms of what's determined in the model, I know I didn't present it in great detail. The CNY USD exchange rate is what matters for a Chinese consumer buying imports, right? That's the cost of a tradable good, and that's pinned down by the fact that trade needs to equal the capital inflow, right? That's how you pin it down. And then the offshore CNH USD exchange rate is pinned down by arbitrage by foreigners, right? That's how we set up the model. But we do, as you say, have triangular arbitrage in the model. But there's three different conditions that all hold to achieve that. Yeah, but beyond that, I think we can think carefully about this and whether we want to do something with expectations as well, because there's no expectations right now. It's all deterministic. Yes. Any more questions?
Very cool paper. I was wondering about generally like the vulnerabilities in the system, if you had any thoughts on that. In particular, I was thinking, if some countries wanted to engage in some speculative activity against this CNH, wanted to raise the value, could they buy up? There doesn't seem to be that many outstanding. Could they buy up the full stock? Could that mean that China's unable to maintain the peg? Yeah, just your thoughts on that.
So the way we set the model is that foreigners want to invest in China. They want to hold this stuff for various reasons. I mean, we haven't got capital flight in there. We could add that, but right now it's always they want to invest. And how you pin down the exchange rate is you accommodate that or you don't, right? So if you say, look, I'm taking supply out of the Chinese offshore markets, I make those deposits decline, which I showed on slide 2, then I can basically make the CNH appreciate dramatically because foreigners want to buy it, but there isn't enough out there to basically constrain supply. If I want the exchange rate to fall, they want to buy it, sure, have it, I can expand my supply. And I can kind of control that up to a limit as a central bank, right? The limit is, I've hit that phi equals 0. There's no more liquidity costs anymore, right? And to go beyond that, you have to play with other wedges, basically, which aren't in the model. We can add them, but they're not there.
Yeah, I have a related question. So here you emphasize a lot of what central bank is doing.
Yeah.
And I guess you talk a little bit about liquidity measure, but then with this arbitrage force, then how much that is working in terms of achieving this peg between CNH and CNY. And also a small question about here in the model, you have the domestic Chinese households and the foreigners who will hold CNH. How about their elasticity of demand? I guess in the estimation you have this one, right? Yeah. But it's very nice paper. Thank you.
Sure, it's a great question. So I didn't say this in my presentation. So actually we do quantify, in your first question, we quantify exactly the shares. So 1/6 of the work maintaining the peg comes from monetary expansion. I think, if I remember correctly, half comes from the fact that shocks are stationary to dissipate, and the remainder then comes from liquidity policies. So that's the calculation. So we actually have that decomposition in the paper. On your other question, so there is an elasticity of demand from Chinese households for CNH foreigners just invest subject to UIP. Right? They have perfectly elastic demand for CNH. Adding the same Gabin-Majori friction that we just saw in the previous slide, it doesn't change the logic of the paper, it just complicates it. And so, I mean, we can add that in efficiency if we wanted to, but the sort of message from the analysis wouldn't change dramatically. So it's just baggage to carry around. Any more questions? I guess we're out of time. Oh, sorry.
So I'm wondering, so you don't have any role for Hong Kong dollar, right? But if you think about the liquidity of CNH and Hong Kong dollar, there's some sort of competition. So how do you think about that?
I haven't thought about it. It's a great question. And we probably should, but I don't know the answer to that question.
So I want to ask, in the model, can you rationalize both premiums and discounts? And also, is the idea of exchange rates being the burden of adjustment, so you're holding interest rates constant, so it's the onshore and offshore rates aren't changing in response?
On the second question, yes. So you can achieve, we have interest rates in the model, but it's fixed. You can achieve similar things by having interest rate policy. They've chosen not to use that for whatever reason. Okay. On your first question, yeah, we can rationalize both directions. E greater than 1, E less than 1. Yeah. Any more? Okay. So now you're going to hear about the Hong Kong dollar.